Hello, everyone, and welcome to this second screencast lecture on the cardiovascular system. In this second lecture, we're going to continue our discussion of the blood vessels by taking a look at veins, and then we're going to move into some basic concepts associated with the heart. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, whenever we look at the veins, remember the veins are going to transport blood toward the heart. With that in mind, the veins are going to be considered to be afferent, right? Because they're going to allow access of the blood to the heart. So let's take a look at the structure of the veins, and what we're going to see is that they have a very similar structure to that of arteries. The walls of the veins, just like arteries, consist of three layers, and we refer to those three layers as tunics. The innermost layer, just like with the artery, is referred to as the tunica intima. The middle layer is referred to as the tunica media. But here are some things to note, differences between the tunica media and the tunica intima. Excuse me. First, the smooth muscle layer in the tunica media is much thinner than it is in the arteries. And part of the reason for that is because the veins are kind of passively receiving the blood from the capillary beds. They're further away from the heart, so the blood pressure is lower. They don't have to resist as much pressure, and so the smooth muscle is going to be much thinner than it is in the arteries. But because that smooth muscle is much thinner, the veins are said to be collapsible. There are classic experiments done where we could hold veins and we can flush out the blood from the veins, and if the blood is removed from the veins, we see that they collapse. Then if we allow the blood to re-enter the veins, then we can see that as the blood re-enters and the pressure goes up in the vein kind of re-inflates. And then the third layer of the vein is the tunica externa, also known as the tunica adventitia. We should also note here that larger veins also contain valves. These valves are important because they prevent the backflow of blood. The blood pressure is a lot lower, and oftentimes whenever we're, let's say, for example, in a standing position, gravity will tend to want to pull the blood back down, let's say, for example, in the legs, away from the heart when the blood pressure drops, to prevent the blood from flowing back due to gravity away from the heart. There are valves that will snap shut and prevent the blood from coming back down. So when the heart contracts, the pressure goes up. That pressure is able to overcome the force of gravity, let's say, for example, in our legs, and the veins, the valves in the veins open up and allow the blood to pass up through the vein. Then when the heart relaxes and the blood pressure drops, the weight of the blood pushes back down on the valve closes and stops the blood from falling back down through the vein all the way to where it came from. In this way, by opening and closing with the beat of the heart, this allows the blood to continue to move back toward the heart and not fall back due to gravity. Okay, hope that makes sense to everyone. So structurally, here's what it looks like. We have the innermost layer. Remember, the tunica intima is made up of endothelium. The endothelium is made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue along with a basement membrane or basal lamina. The next layer contains the smooth muscle tissue. Notice the thinness, how the smooth muscle tissue is thinner in the wall of the vein than it is in the artery. Go back and compare that to arteries. And then we have the outermost layer, which is comprised of that loose connective tissue. So the way it breaks out, we're going to have, excuse me, the tunica intima being made up of the endothelium and basal lamina. We have the smooth muscle tissue, which makes up the tunica media. And we have the connective tissue making up the tunica adventitia or the tunica externa. Also, we don't want to forget, remember that the internal space of the blood vessel is referred to as the lumen. Now, in addition, one of the other things you may note here is that when we compare this to the artery, The vein has no internal or external elastic membranes. These are not present in the veins. And again, this has to do with the fact that the veins are passively receiving blood. They don't have nearly as high pressure in them. They don't need to be able to stretch and to recoil, so that those elastic membranes, the internal and external elastic membranes or lamina, are not necessary in veins, and so we don't see them. But that also contributes to the collapsibility of the veins. Okay, furthermore, remember we talked about the arteries, and we said the main artery coming out of the heart is the aorta, and then the aorta gives off branches, and those branches give off branches, and so each branch becomes smaller and smaller and smaller until you finally wind up with the smallest branches that are just barely visible to the naked eye, and we refer to them as arterioles. Well, the same thing is going to happen with veins. So the capillary beds are going to come back together to form the tiniest of the veins that are just barely visible to the naked eye. These are referred to as the venules now. So venules are akin to the arterioles. The venules then will drain blood from the capillaries. They will come together to form larger veins, which will come together to form larger veins, and so on and so forth until we get to the largest veins in the body, which are the superior and inferior vena cava, and they return the blood back directly to the heart then. All right, so enough on the blood vessels. Let's turn our attention briefly to the heart. As we can see here in the diagram in the inset on our icon on our slide here, the heart is kind of a cone-shaped organ. It's kind of broader at one end, and then it comes to a tapering point at the other end. Also, we note that it's located right behind the sternum or the breastbone. The apex, which is this little tapered end right here, this is referred to the apex. The opposite, the broad portion, is referred to as the base. We note that the apex points to the left. Structurally, and let's take a look at external structure, we see the wall of the heart is referred to as the myocardium because the heart wall is made up of cardiac muscle tissue. Myo meaning muscle, cardi meaning heart, muscle tissue of the heart. So it consists of cardiac muscle tissue. Surrounding the myocardium, there is a structure called the pericardium. The pericardium is a serous membrane sac that supports and protects the heart. Now remember what a serous membrane is. A serous membrane is a wet membrane that covers all body organs that are not exposed to the outside. And a serous membrane is a double membrane, so it has two layers to it. So the heart kind of sits inside of this sac, which is referred to as the pericardium, and it's a serous membrane sac. Internally, we see the heart is divided by an internal wall, which is referred to as the septum. The septum will separate the heart then into right and left sides, or right and left halves. In addition, we note that there are 4 chambers or cavities that are located in the heart. 2 of them, the upper chambers, are referred to as atria, and 2 of them, the lower chambers, are referred to as ventricles. Continuing with our internal look at the heart, we also note that there are valves inside the heart. These valves are important because, just like in the veins, they help to prevent the backward movement of blood. They keep the blood from coming back from where it was ejected from, let's say, for example, in the heart. There are 2 sets of valves in the heart. The first set of valves are referred to as the atrioventricular valves. That's because they are on the border between the atria and the ventricles. AR meaning pertaining to what? The border between the atria and the ventricles. There are 2 atrioventricular valves, one on the right side, one on the left side. The tricuspid valve is located on the right side between the right atrium and the right ventricle. The second atrioventricular valve is called the bicuspid valve, or oftentimes clinically it's referred to as the mitral valve. It's located between the left atrium and the left ventricle. So the tricuspid valve will prevent blood from flowing back into the right atrium when the right ventricle contracts. The bicuspid or mitral valve will prevent the backward movement of blood from into, I should say, the left atrium when the left ventricle contracts. Now, controlling these two valves, there are strong, fibrous, I should say, cords of connective tissue that support those valves. These are called the chordae tendineae. They are attached directly to the valves at one end, and they are attached to little finger-like projections of muscle tissue, internal muscle tissue of the heart wall. And these little finger-like projections are referred to as papillary muscles. So when the ventricle contracts, what's going to happen is, let's take, for example, that bicuspid valve. And so what happens is blood is going to, we'll take a closer look at this in a bit, but blood is going to drain from the left atrium into the left ventricle. As it does, the valve opens up and allows the blood to drain as it's received into the heart from the left atrium into the left ventricle. Once the left ventricle adequately fills, it's going to contract and start to push the blood out of the heart. As it does, we don't want the blood to go back up into the atrium. So what's going to happen is the pressure, as the ventricle starts to squeeze, as the blood pressure goes up in the heart, it's going to push that valve closed. Now, what would happen is, because the pressure is higher in the ventricle than in the atrium, the valve would tend to want to evert or go push back up toward the atrium, or what we might call prolapse. But this doesn't happen because of the chordae tendineae. Instead, the chordae tendineae become taut and keep the valve closed instead of everting or prolapsing. This forces the blood to not go back into the left atrium, but rather get diverted, and as we'll see a little bit later, enter into the aorta. In addition, excuse me, to the atrioventricular valves, there are two semilunar valves. One semilunar valve is located at the base of the aorta. The second semilunar valve is located at the base of the pulmonary trunk. So again, when that ventricle contracts and pushes blood into the aorta, the pressure of the blood, or the pressure from the ventricle, causes the blood to enter the aorta. At the base of the aorta, there's a valve, the aortic semilunar valve, that opens up and allows the blood to pass into the aorta. But when the ventricle relaxes and the pressure drops, the weight of the blood would have a tendency to want to fall, cause it to fall back into the heart. But this valve, the aortic semilunar valve, rather, as the blood hits it, it snaps shut and prevents the blood from going back down into the ventricle. The same thing with the pulmonic semilunar valve. It's located at the base of the pulmonary trunk, which allows blood to exit the right ventricle on its way to the lungs. So the pulmonic valve opens up when the right ventricle contracts. When the right ventricle relaxes, the valve closes and stops blood from flowing or falling back down into the right ventricle. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the overall view of blood flow through the heart. And let's begin at the right atrium. So the right atrium is going to receive oxygen-poor blood from two major blood vessels, the superior vena cava, which is going to drain the head, neck, and chest. All the blood from the head, neck, chest, and upper extremities is going to enter the right atrium via the superior vena cava, and the inferior vena cava, which brings blood back from the lower extremities and the torso into the right atrium once again. So now what's going to happen is once the blood enters the right atrium, it's going to begin to drain down into the right ventricle. It'll fill the right ventricle, but then toward the end, the right atrium will kind of sort of give a kick. And when it gives that kick, or when it contracts, it'll push any remaining blood through the tricuspid valve and into the right ventricle. So we pick up now with the right ventricle. It's going to receive the blood, as we noted, from the right atrium. Once the right ventricle fills, it now will contract. Its contraction is going to squeeze or push the blood up. Remember, it's going to hit the tricuspid valve. Tricuspid valve is going to close, and that's going to divert the blood over into the major blood vessel coming out of the right ventricle, which is the pulmonary trunk. So now the pulmonary trunk is going to carry the oxygen poor blood toward the lungs. The pulmonary trunk will then divide into the pulmonary arteries, and the pulmonary arteries will transport blood directly to the lungs. Okay, now remember, these are the pulmonary arteries because arteries are what? Efferent. They allow blood to exit the heart. So even though this is oxygen poor blood, okay, we're not going to think of this as a vein. These are arteries because they're allowing the blood to exit the heart and be transported to the lungs. So the blood goes to the lungs and now becomes oxygenated, and that oxygenated blood now is going to return to the left atrium. So the left atrium now is going to receive this oxygenated or oxygen-rich blood, and it receives it from 4 veins called the pulmonary veins. And again, veins are afferent. They allow blood to access the heart. Okay, so we're not talking about whether it's oxygen-rich or oxygen-poor for veins or arteries. It's whether the blood is exiting the heart or being received by the heart. So now what's going to happen? The blood's going to enter the left atrium, and as the blood enters the left atrium, the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve is going to open up basically from the weight of the blood, and the blood is going to drain down into the left ventricle, filling the left ventricle. Now eventually, at the end of the resting phase, the left atrium then will give a kick or a contraction, and that'll push any remaining blood through that mitral or bicuspid valve and on into the left ventricle, finishing the filling of the left ventricle. Okay, so now we're at the left ventricle. The left ventricle then receives the blood from the left atrium, as we mentioned. Once it fills, the left ventricle will then undergo a contraction phase, and the contraction will push the blood through the aortic semilunar valve and into the aorta. So remember, what's going to happen is when that ventricle contracts, that bicuspid valve is going to snap shut because of the chordate tendon AE. Blood's going to get diverted, and it's going to go directly into the aorta through the aortic semilunar valve. The aorta then is going to carry that oxygen-rich blood out to all the body tissues. The aorta, as we mentioned before, will branch into smaller and smaller arteries and eventually into the arterioles and give rise to the capillary beds. It's important for us to note here that oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood will never mix under normal circumstances in the heart. Because of that septum, we have the heart divided into the right and left sides. So on the right side, we're going to have the heart pumping oxygen-poor blood. On the left side, we're going to have heart pumping oxygen-rich blood that has returned from the lungs. Okay. For that reason, the heart is noted as a double pump. It's pumping both oxygen-poor blood and oxygen-rich blood at the same time to different areas, and never the two shall mix. So here's just a diagram then that we can go over that shows the blood flow pattern through the heart. So here we have RA, the right atrium, and the right atrium is receiving blood from the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. That blood is going to drain and pass through the tricuspid valve here into the right ventricle. The right ventricle is going to fill. The right ventricle will then contract and push the blood up. That'll snap the tricuspid valve closed and divert the blood here into the pulmonary trunk, or in this case, they label it PA for pulmonary aorta. You can see the key down here at the bottom. As the blood enters the pulmonary aorta, it passes through the pulmonary valve, or the pulmonic semilunar valve. Now, when the right ventricle relaxes, what's going to happen is the weight of this blood is going to push back down in this valve, and it's going to snap shut to prevent the blood from flowing back down into the right ventricle here. So now the blood, the pulmonary aorta, I should say, divides into the pulmonary arteries, okay, the left and right pulmonary arteries, and it carries the blood, as we can see here in the diagram, to the lungs. The blood becomes oxygenated and now returns to the heart via the pulmonary veins. Here are the 4 pulmonary veins carrying the blood back into the left atrium. As blood enters the left atrium, it drains through the mitral valve and into the left ventricle. Once the left ventricle fills with blood, it contracts and pushes the blood out through the aorta. Remember that what's going to happen, because of the chordae tendon AE, the mitral valve is going to snap shut and divert the blood over into the aorta. As it enters into the aorta, it's going to pass through the aortic semilunar valve, and then from the aorta, it's going to go out via branches to all parts of the body, or all tissues of the body. Now, when this left ventricle relaxes to get ready for another contraction, the weight of the blood is going to want to pull back down into the left ventricle, but this aortic valve is going to snap shut to prevent the blood from coming back down into the heart. Okay, I do want to pause for a minute and talk a little bit about coronary circulation, because the heart is an organ and it needs oxygen, it needs nutrients, it needs to get rid of waste products, and needs to get rid of carbon dioxide. So we need that exchange of respiratory gases, and we need the exchange of nutrients and waste products. How is that accomplished? It's accomplished through the coronary circulation. Let's take a look. The coronary circulation is comprised of both coronary arteries and veins. Let's take a look at the coronary arteries first. Their job is to supply the heart muscle itself, the myocardium, with blood to provide the oxygen and nutrients that the myocardium, the heart muscle tissue, is going to need to live and be able to do its job. These coronary arteries actually originate from the base of the aorta, so that when blood enters the aorta, right there at the base of the aorta, there are 2 little openings, and the blood passes out through these 2 openings into the right and left coronary arteries, and then from there into branches that provide blood to the entire musculature of the heart. Eventually, they'll branch and form arterioles, which will communicate with the capillary beds, as we've seen. And then we have the coronary veins. Again, these are formed from smaller venules that communicate with the capillary beds, and they will parallel the coronary arteries and eventually return the blood back to the heart via a sac-like structure on the posterior surface of the heart, just at the base of the right atrium, which is referred to as the coronary sinus. So here's a diagram of the coronary circulation, and this is just some of the basics, and we're not going through the entire thing, but some of the main coronary vessels. So we have here, we can see the right coronary artery, and here we can see the left coronary artery. Notice how we have a little difference in coloration here. This is to show that the left coronary artery exits the aorta and it lies behind this pulmonary trunk right here, or pulmonary aorta. So it exits at the base of the aorta, comes down here, and we can see it behind the pulmonary trunk. Now, eventually what's going to happen is this left coronary artery is going to divide, and one branch is going to carry blood around to the back side of the heart. This is referred to as the circumflex artery because it flexes or bends around the circumference of the heart. And then we have this branch which carries blood down across the anterior surface of the heart. This is referred to as the left anterior descending artery, or the LAD. Notice how these all give off branches that carry blood into the heart tissue. We don't see the capillary beds here because they're microscopic. And here we can see the right coronary artery and how it gives off branches that go around to the back side of the heart, and also this marginal artery that comes down along this edge or end of the heart that we see here. Now these arteries communicate with capillary beds, which then communicate with venules, which then return the blood to we can see here in gray, the anterior cardiac vein. And here we can see a great cardiac vein. And again, there are many more coronary blood vessels than these, but just to give you a basic sense of how things are going on. Now, what's going to happen is this anterior cardiac vein and great cardiac vein are going to go around the heart, and they're going to return blood to the coronary sinus and eventually into the right atrium of the heart. Okay. All right, so I think we'll finish there for today. And in our next lecture, we're going to take a look at the cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle refers to the heartbeat. So each beat of the heart is one cardiac cycle. And we're going to break that all down and see the significance of the cardiac cycle as we move forward. But we'll end there for today.